Welcome to the Sexual Violent Research Initiative and World Bank Group's webinar on our new Voices from the South series. I am Liz Dartnell, the SVRI's Executive Director, and have the privilege to open this webinar to launch two new thematic briefs on research that the SVRI and the World Bank Group have supported on early interventions and engaging men and boys to end violence against women. But before I share today's agenda with you, first, some housekeeping. We are together for an hour. The event platform is Zoom webinar, and we are being recorded. Our online participants will be muted for the duration of the event. And for those of you online with us today, while we are getting started, please do introduce yourself in the chat and tell us where you are in the world. The webinar is being recorded and will be shared with you via email and will be uploaded to both the SVRI and World Bank Group's websites. Wordly is available for translation into multiple languages. It is a software that provides translation generated by artificial intelligence in real time into multiple languages. So to use Wordly during a Zoom session, click on the link that Angelica has just pasted into the chat. Select the language of your choice and resize the window so you can view the Zoom session. Throughout the webinar, please do share any questions you have either in the chat or in the Q&A part of the Zoom. We have a really packed agenda for you today, filled with extraordinary researchers and practitioners. First up, we have Professor Rachel Dukes. It is such an honor, Rachel, to have you with us today. For those of you who don't know Rachel, apart from being a key thinker and leader in our field, Rachel is one of the founders of the Sexual Violence Research Initiative and is currently an SVRI Leadership Council member. Rachel is also the Executive Scientist for Research Strategy at the South African Medical Research Council. Welcome, Rachel. Rachel will be setting the scene for our discussions today by presenting what is the evidence telling us on what works in engaging men and boys in interventions to prevent violence against women. Rachel's presentation will be followed by a panel discussion moderated by Diana Arango, the Senior Gender Advisor at the World Bank Group. Diana, with our panel of experts, will discuss the importance of research on violence against women in lower middle-income countries, led by lower middle-income country researchers, and in particular talk about engaging men and boys in preventing violence against women and the importance of starting young. Our panelists, we have a great panel for you, include Wessel van den Berg, who is the Research Monitoring and Evaluation and Learning Unit Manager with Sonke Gender Justice in South Africa. We have Majd Hamid, researcher and gender advisor at the Tri Center for Training and Education from Jordan, and Dr. Godfrey Su from the Child Health and Development Center at Makerere University in Uganda. Just a fantastic panel. Immediately after the panel, we'll have a discussion from our very own Angelica Pino, SVRI's Grant Manager and Capacity Strengthening Director. Angelica will launch the two briefs and provide some key insights and highlights from the research, after which we will endeavour to answer all your questions. So please do write them in the chat. And please note, we do have load shedding in South Africa right now, so some of us might go on and off, but we all have each other's slides and information, so we will continue on irregardless of what's going on. So we are going to be busy, and over to you straight away, Rachel, to start us off. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Liz, and good afternoon, everyone. I'm really delighted to be able to present at this very exciting webinar and to share later on hearing the results of the new research. I want to provide some background on what works in engaging men and boys in interventions to prevent violence against women and girls, first of all. Next slide, please. So I think it's really critical when we think about this to digest a thumbnail sketch around the politics that we're talking about, because the whole notion of engaging men and boys in violence prevention is based on the premise that those who perpetrate violence should be central to its prevention. And this premise is absolutely fundamental in this area of work. Of course they should be, and particularly in the global south, where we have so many settings with very, very highly patriarchal gender norms. It's really, really essential that we have men and boys involved in prevention of violence against women and girls, because so often we hear that women and girls really struggle to have the power to change gender dynamics within their lives if men and boys are not engaged. But, and there is a but here, investing in engaging men and boys without centrally positioning women and girls can enable men to have a dialogue about their violence without any restitution. And this results in perpetuating the exclusion of women and girls and their narratives and their trauma from the whole area of debate and discussion. It also enables investment in interventions that may be aimed at changing the way in which men and boys think about themselves, maybe aimed at making them feel much better about themselves after that's happened, but without providing anything for women who've suffered the trauma. And research that's been done recently, particularly through What Works, has shown that interventions to prevent violence against women that actually provide support for survivors of violence seem to be more effective than interventions that seek to change gender norms and be in a trend of transformative using a variety of methods that don't actually provide support for survivors of violence. So I think it's incredibly important that as we go into this discussion, that when we talk about engaging men and boys, it shouldn't be taken to mean, even if we're using it as a shorthand, that we're talking about only engaging men and boys, because it's vitally important that we position engaging men and boys alongside engaging women and girls. Next slide. So another key question we need to think about in this area is, what are we engaging men and boys to do? And there are actually different ways in which they have been engaged. There are some interventions that engage men and boys with the aim of correcting or avoiding certain attitudes and behaviours, focusing on violence as an isolated behaviour to stop men being violent, or focusing on how men think about gender as an isolated set of attitudes to change. And the evidence around the effectiveness of these interventions is really quite different from the evidence around the effectiveness of interventions where men and boys are being engaged in order to take them on a journey to fundamentally question what it means for them to be a man or a boy, question their power and their position, and how they relate to women and other genders. In other words, these are the gender transformative approaches. And these approaches basically challenge gender relations and norms as a central part of their program objectives. They integrally link gender and social empowerment, and this is seen as fundamental for both men and for women going through these approaches. Acknowledging the relational construction of gender, they include women and include men, and acknowledge the lived experience of gender norms, including men's reflections on the negative experiences they've had in living out or seeking to live out gender norms within their society. And these approaches recognize that change is a collective process and that involves transforming deeply held beliefs, values, and opinions through processes that include critical reflection. This is our fundamental platform of this work, participatory approaches, and approaches that involve reflection on one's own vulnerability and self-awareness in relation to others. And I think that this, you can see by the way I'm emphasizing this, that these are really the most important and fundamental approaches used when we think about and talk about engaging men and boys. There is one other group though, because some interventions engage men and boys in order to address certain particular behaviors, in particular harmful alcohol use or major risk factors related to mental health. And there is some evidence, as I'll show you in a minute, that these can be effective as well. Next slide. So what do we know about the interventions and the groups of interventions that engage men and boys that have been shown to be effective from the global literature? Well, the slides I'm going to present are taken from an analysis that was done looking at all of the interventions globally that have been shown to impact on violence against women and girls up to the end of 2018. And this was conducted and published as one of the flagship reports at the end of the What Works to Prevent Violence Against Women and Girls program. So I apologize if I leave off interventions that may have been evaluated afterwards. And when we looked at the global literature, and it's interesting, we found 96 evaluated interventions that had an outcome of prevention of violence against women and girls. And there was considerable evidence of several of these being effective. One of these was gender transformative programming at the point of new fatherhood. And I think the stellar example in this category is the Banda Berejo intervention that was evaluated by the team from Promundo in Rwanda. And this was a set of participatory group sessions that were delivered to fathers predominantly, but for, I believe it was 8 sessions, the men's partners were brought in. And the men were targeted because their wives or girlfriends were pregnant. And it was, the intervention was delivered towards the end of the pregnancy, around the time of delivery, or else during the first few years of the children's lives. And it seems that this was a life stage when men seemed to be particularly open to reflecting on their identity as men. And there is very good evidence from this particular evaluation, but also from an evaluation of family foundations, which is a somewhat similar intervention from the United States, and some promising evidence from the Real Fathers intervention in Uganda, that these types of interventions are effective. Next slide. There is another group of interventions which are also working with couples, and these interventions may also be implemented where men and women are involved in groups, but they're not selected because they're couples. So I'm saying in the heading they're involved as single individuals, although occasionally it does turn out that there are couples within the interventions. Now, 2 of the couples interventions that have shown very strong evidence of being effective are the Indashikiwa intervention that was developed and implemented in What Works in Rwanda, and the first Stepping Stones evaluation that was conducted in Gambia. And in Gambia, the intervention Stepping Stones was delivered to all of the adults living in rural villages in the study setting. And this intervention was shown to have effectively ended violence in those villages, sustained up to 4 years after Stepping Stones was delivered. In one of the very small examples where there does appear to be some evidence of violence, actually levels of violence being taken to 0 within a community. And there are some very interesting questions about how they achieved that, but also I have some reflections on whether that would be automatically repeatable elsewhere. Ndashikiwa was working in a very high violence setting in Rwanda with couples over 5 months and came up with very good evidence of being able to prevent violence within these couples. These interventions were all both gender transformative and also focused in important ways on building relationship skills and so strengthening the relationship of the couples. Stepping Stones used in South Africa has been used in a different context. And in the South African context, men and women have been recruited as what I call singles. And in that context, what we've seen is that Stepping Stone seems to be much more effective for men than it does for the women who are participating without their male partner. And I think that's something very important to think about. Not that it's bad for men's violence to be reduced, and particularly in informal settlements in what works, we saw that the most violent men seem to reduce their use of violence the most. And that's a really important finding. But it's also very important in the other settings that we saw women reporting reductions in violence too. Next slide. So another type of intervention is engaging men and boys in social norms change interventions. And these interventions always require the whole community. So you have to involve women and girls because they're an integral part of every community. There are some very good results in these interventions where relationships are strengthened. And SASA, as we all know, has some of the is an example of good results in the first evaluation in Uganda. And what's really interesting is when you read the qualitative research on the SASA evaluation, you can see clearly the narratives of intervention, of relationship strengthening that came through that intervention. The Transforming Masculinities implemented by Tear Fund and Heal Africa in the Eastern DRC put in place in the community couples workshops combined with work with clergy, pop-up engagement in different settings and survivor support. And so here you can see the couples theme around strengthening relationships. There are other examples of these types of interventions that have been nothing like as successful. And I think the One Man Can Sonke change intervention is an example, and this has now been evaluated twice in rigorous studies. And although there were some issues with the intervention design and implementation, I think what is key is that the way that these interventions have been presented is that they don't equally integrate work with women as well as work with men, and they don't provide survivor support, and there isn't a direct focus on relationship strengthening. And you can begin to see the weaknesses and why interventions that are focusing and positioning engaging men and boys in social norms change may encounter pitfalls if they're not seen as being gender transformative and embracing in an equal sense work with women and girls. Next slide. So another set of these interventions are the couples interventions on IPV and substance abuse programming. And it is interesting, they don't always actually, they're not really gender transformative. They don't always really tackle gender issues within the relationships. But where we have alcohol abuse as a major problem driving violence, it does seem that engaging men and boys and women and girls can result in much better effect from the intervention. Wendy Wechsberg's series of interventions known as co-ops in South Africa have shown that the couples co-op, so when men and women as couples came in for a brief substance abuse and intervention that also focuses on the relationship and on gender-based violence prevention, results are much more effective than when only the men's co-op or the women's co-op interventions were used. And the same with the VAW intervention, which was looking at harmful alcohol abuse and mental health problems in Zambia in the context of relationships where there was a lot of violence prevention. Again, very strong results, not a gender transformative program. And it is interesting in this one sort of subset of interventions that where the behavior is reinforced by a couple's interventions, including men, can be very effective, much more effective than interventions don't include the couple. Next slide. So circling back, I think when we're thinking about engaging men and boys, the critical questions are, how are we going to engage men and boys? Are we talking about only working with them, or are we talking about working with them as well as women and girls? And I think that that is vital. A second question is, what are we engaging them to do? And are we engaging them in a process of gender transformative intervention, or are we engaging them just to change ideas and behaviors, which is nothing like as effective? Another key question is, how do we engage with men and boys without teaching them the talk, without how to walk the walk? And that is a really key problem. And that is a problem that's encountered with these interventions that are not gender transformative. And it's very, very important that we don't end up with a string of people who can talk about hegemonic masculinity and how important it is to do the washing up. But actually, they're not giving power to women within relationships and behaving in a way that's gender equitable. I believe that the answer lies in centrally positioning women in the work that we do with men. And I think that if we don't do that, it's very, very difficult to carry out a properly joined up gender transformative intervention with men. Next slide. So my final thoughts. From looking at the interventions, what we've seen are that involving men and boys in interventions with women and girls can be very successful. The key questions are how and why it's done, and is there a focus on gender transformative programming, relationship strengthening, or changing and mutually reinforcing behavior? Or are we only challenging men's behavior and attitudes outside these contexts, which is much less effective? So working with men and boys can be incredibly impactful, but it requires very thoughtful programming. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Rachel, for that really clear presentation. I'm sure many of us are thankful that this is being recorded so we can go back and listen to it one more time. There was a lot of learning and a lot of good messaging from it. Now I'm happy, and also thank you for staying to time, Rachel. I'm happy to be moderating the panel with Maj, Vessel. Godfrey, are you there? If you can, I think you are. Turn your camera on, but I can start, maybe Maj, I can start with you. So you're in Jordan. Oh, okay, there you go. And you've surveyed 1,270 couples participating in pre-marriage courses to help them understand marital and legal rights under Sharia law. I wanted to ask you, as all of you in this panel are really kind of on the front lines working with men and boys, what were the responses of men in this intervention regarding domestic violence? And what have you learned about engaging men in violence against women prevention efforts in the MENA region in general? And how has this impacted your work moving forward?
Mm-hmm. Thank you, Diana. Good morning, everybody, and good evening. Our Preventing Intimate Partner Violence study aimed to understand the knowledge, behavior, and attitudes of the newly married couples in Jordan about marital life, gender norms, and violence. Almost 13% and more of the male sample tended to use and justify violence against the woman, violence against their wife, and 30% are also neutral in a negative way, that they say they don't know if men have the right to use physical violence with their wives or no. The respondents pointed out that difficult economic conditions and extended family problems were the main reasons for any dispute that may lead to violence from their perspectives. And 10% of the male respondents accepted to participate in the project second intervention to receive awareness message and attend awareness sessions, we found high resistance from men to participate in both the survey and the interventions. They started the survey and then they stopped it. While your question to engagement in violence against women prevention efforts in the MENA region, the findings of our study pointed out that the health and local community centers could play a deeper role in solving social problems. So investing in building social and health male care providers' capacity to respond to violence against women as an important approach. Our study also showed us that the most cases that achieved a positive impact were the cases in which the young men participated regularly in our lectures and awareness session. So regular communication and awareness message to the young couples through WhatsApp message or YouTube or focus group discussion, and also individual consultations could make a difference. The awareness message might include the importance of family life, the status of women and the rights of both spouses, and the elements of sexual and reproductive health issues, and ways to resist psychological pressure and ways to move away from violence in various forms in the face of marital problems, and also the preventive services available to protect against violence. Now, also engaging and working with women in violence against women prevention efforts can be useful, especially in increasing knowledge in both religious, legal aspects and also sexual and reproductive health interventions that provide psychological and health support. But at the end, we still need more research, more evidence to study in depth the young men's resistance to change attitudes and harmful norms. It is essential to tackle with men as partners in violence prevention projects, working more on men's privilege, men's interest, and men's resistance to change. We have the responsibility, we think, to assist this in the education of boys and girls in schools and elsewhere, to prepare the young men to be ready to learn, to listen, to be educated, to be humble, and to understand about gender equality. Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Maj, and thank you especially for telling us about some of those techniques that you used to keep the men engaged and making sure that they didn't drop out of the work that you were doing. That's so helpful because it is kind of a constant challenge to think how we can continue to keep them coming back and participating in our work. And so that was super helpful. Thank you.
Thank you.
Gottfried, I think you're on, but I'm going to move over to Vessel. How are you doing? Thank you for joining us. So we all know Sankey Gender Justice is a pioneer of much of the work on engaging men and boys to end violence against women and violence against children in South Africa and globally. And so this panel, as we've seen, is about the importance of research and research partnership in improving programs to end violence against women. And I was just wondering if there was any study that comes to mind that profoundly impacted how you think about this work and the way in which Sankey works in its programs with men and boys, and what you learned. What was that study?
Sure. Thanks, Diana. I'm actually going to take the liberty just to refer to 3 studies.
Okay.
And I'll try and be quick about it. The overarching message, the analogy that I have for it is similar to talking about a goldfish in a goldfish bowl. So if a goldfish is sick, I can give the fish some medicine and see if that increases the health of the fish, or I can change the water. I can change the context or the structures around the fish rather than dealing with the fish directly. So I apply this and this is a lesson that comes from these 3 studies. So I think the first one is some of the results from our first randomized control trial on one-man can in Bushbuck Ridge. And I wouldn't agree that One Man Can is entirely unsuccessful in its completeness. I think we did have some success in some regards. There were some peer-reviewed papers that came out of that first study that did show that we did have some success on reducing negative gender norms amongst men. However, the studies were quite clear that this didn't translate into behavior change. And I just staying with the analogy of the fish in the tank, I really think it's important to think structurally about this problem, not only about the individual level of change. The second study is a wonderful book that came out by Professor Bob Pease from Tasmania University called Facing Patriarchy. And I really want to support Rachel's point that centering women is a really important step towards the work with engaging men and boys. And again, to follow the analogy of the context or the structures surrounding the individual change, let me take where I'm applying that is that, we may have really good evidence for educational group interventions, but the contexts in which these interventions happen are as important or even more important than the particular evidence of that intervention on its own. So the structure that comes to mind is the structure of the organization Sonke Gender Justice. So we have seen a real shift in the last few years in the organization's leadership, in the languaging, and in the ownership of the organization as a pro-feminist and feminist organization, led by women and proudly engaging in women's rights work. And I think the language shift from the earlier work that we were doing, which was really focusing on men, towards this broader women's rights agenda, is an example of the structural change that it takes to make interventions and individual work succeed, especially by centering women. So I really agree with that. And I think that's a big point that Professor Pease makes in that book, Facing Patriarchy, where in the first chapter, and I'm not going to go through a detailed explanation of the book, but a big point that he makes is that the public health approach to preventing violence against women, which depends on the socio-ecological framework, is often at risk of depoliticizing the work. When we work systemically, when we apply Bronfenbrenner or one of these systemic approaches, and we think that if only we work on all the levels, that doesn't mean that we are necessarily engaging with the structural political power of men, in fact, that are controlling these spaces. And that is the patriarchy space that we do need to face. Then the third one, so the first one was that the very small scale, it's not small, it was a major RCT actually, but our first kind of lesson from the RCT of One Man Can in Bushbuck Ridge. The second one is this book by Professor Pease called Facing Patriarchy, which I can really recommend colleagues to read. And then the third one is, of course, the paper that came out by Michael Flood and Alan Gregg, commissioned by UN Women, that many of you would already be familiar with, which is a really great review of the evidence. And I think it underscores the point that, and I really like the way that they phrased it in their publication, that it's less field and more movement. So thinking more politically about what is the movement that this work forms part of, the decades of work that women's rights networks have done, the context within that work, which that work is happening, that's the context that this work needs to proceed in. And I think that, from Sonke, what we've seen is we started off with a socio-ecological system. And to answer your question about how these studies have influenced our work, we moved from only thinking about it as a kind of a static set of levels, which actually have informed our organizational structure, to more thinking about how can we have a dialogue between the grassroots interventions and structural changes like policy changes. So, for example, we've shifted our investment and our attention from only doing interventions to doing interventions with people in conjunction with work like local government accountability, working with municipalities, working with town councils, and of course the bigger structural changes like the National Strategic Plan and those others. So that's, in summary, let's think about the tank, the goldfish bowl, the structures in conjunction with the fish. Thank you.
Thank you so much. I feel like that you made so many wonderful points, but I really, what spoke to me was this call to think structurally as well and build movements and work with governments and accountability structures that are also kind of perpetuating the norms in which we're trying to challenge. So thank you so much. I felt like that was a small little mini masterclass. Thank you. Godfrey, I know you're there, so I'm just gonna launch into asking you this question. I hope you can turn your camera on. I hope the other panelists also join me, so I'm not alone. But Godfrey, you work in Uganda. You're part of the leadership in developing it and evaluating the Parenting for Respectability program in Uganda. And I was wondering first, how did you come about choosing this name, Parenting for Respectability? And what did your research find on the effectiveness of engaging men in the Parenting for Respectability program? Gonna unmute you, Godfrey. You're on mute. Can the other Majd Basil, can you join us again?
Okay, right.
Oh,
I
good.
think I'm now on. Great. Thank you very much for giving me an opportunity to be part of this great conversation, and certainly for in-session group-based parenting program that recruits both fathers and mothers. Or if you like, we recruit both male and female parents. I thank Rachel for talking about masculinity earlier. But in Uganda, and indeed in East Africa, masculinity is based on the ideals of reputation and respectability. This is a finding from our previous work done by myself and colleagues in Uganda, and also another colleague of ours in Tanzania, found that men evaluated themselves in terms of two main ideals: respectable ideals or reputational ideals. And of course, this relates to the idea of the ideas that Rachel initially discussed, particularly about hegemonic masculinity. So the parenting program that we developed tries to leverage an important dimension of fatherhood, that is the need to maintain family respectability. From the work that we did, we found that one of the most important motivation for male engagement in family affairs, especially in relationships between their spouses, men and their wives, and men and their children, was the need to ensure that the outcomes in these relationships all contribute to the family honor or respectability. So we thought we should draw from this and pre-existing motivation to try and draw on the positive male norms around family relationships. So the parenting program that we developed, therefore, was to draw from this, because in large part, the appropriate behavior of children and family members more generally was an important positive norm that men cherished. And as we know that there are just a handful of programs, and I think Rachel's presentation was quite informative here. So parenting work is still very young in the region. And so there are few programs that have been successful in recruiting parental couples and fathers in particular, because in this setting, when programs are presented as for parents, the fathers, the men tend to send their wives. They tend to say, oh, they brought a program for you. And so we wanted to see, how do we actually involve men? And it was important that we draw from what motivates them. I totally agree with Rachel. There is need to challenge the negative norms. There is need to be careful about how we might perpetuate male dominance. But at the same time, if you want to draw, involvement and participation, then you need to start from a point that, people value. And we found that drawing on this norm, for example, of masculinity and respectability, enabled men to step back and say, oh, so this thing, if I participate in it, is actually going to improve what I cherish. And we therefore aim to recruit parental couples. So in recruitment of people to the program, we encourage fathers, we encourage mothers to join together. But if they were not able, and again, drawing from Rachel's observation earlier, we allowed whichever parental spouse wanted to join and then possibly co-opt their spouse. And that is really how we came up with the name Parenting for Respectability.
Thank you so much. And I just want to say this has been such an interesting discussion. It's great to hear kind of actually how this worked out in programming when you were implementing on the ground. And I think there have been a lot of questions that have been coming in on how do you actually do this work on the ground? How do you keep men engaged? Is it okay to, like Godfrey, you just said, just have whoever in the couple come and participate? How does that affect men's participation? Some questions are super interesting coming into the chat now, but unfortunately we've run out of time for the panel, and I'm going to pass over to Angelica, but I just want to say we'll come back after Angelica's presentation to have a lively Q&A session with all of our presenters from today. And we're taking note of all those interesting questions coming in. And Maj, thank you for already responding to one in the Q&A. So please keep them coming in. We won't be allowing anyone to speak just because of the limitations of time. But Angelica, over to you.
Thanks, Diana. I will make it very quick because I think there are a lot of questions for the panelists. So just very quick from our side, the PowerPoints. Thank you, Lisa. Thank you. Thanks so much. So just to tell you briefly about our grant-making program. In 2014, this year, I began a grant-making program to support researchers in and from low-middle-income countries. We have a current program running. We have grants from 40,000 to 200,000 over a 2-year period. We put a call every year, and once we get projects running, we provide technical assistance and particularly on ethics of research and research uptake. We provide platforms like this one to disseminate research and networking, to ensure that researchers can reach people in power and affect meaningful change. Over the past 8 years, we have provided over $7 million to fund 68 research projects in 36 countries across the world. Next slide, please. So between 2014 and 2020, in partnership with the World Bank through their Development Marketplace Award, we supported 60 projects across the world. We have launched regional reports for Africa, Asia, Latin America, and the Caribbean to showcase some of the work of the grantees. Great work. And each report highlights a few of our research projects within each region. In the studies, the report identified the researchers, the scope of the work, the knowledge gaps addressed, findings and impacts, and lessons for the field. Next slide. Besides these regional reports, all this based, of course, in our grantees' work, we have published these 2 research briefs on projects that have studied the impact of engagement and voice initiatives and also studying at young age or adolescence to prevent violence against women. And these thematic briefs features projects from Africa, Asia, Latin America, and the Caribbean, and the MENA region. And we really think these reports and the spaces like this one will help us reach more people and potential partners and promote the innovative work of researchers in low-middle-income countries. So very pleased to launch today these thematic briefs and to share some of the projects from the different regions. Next slide, please. You already heard Professor Siu about the Parenting for Respectability program in Uganda. So I'm not going to say more, except to say that we really think that was an extremely successful intervention. We look forward to seeing that adaptation of this promising intervention in other settings. Next slide, please. And moving to Southern Africa, in this project, Promundo and the Living Peace Institute in the DRC evaluated the impact of an initiative developed and piloted in 2013 with 324 men and their partners. And the process enabled them to discuss how war and conflict had influenced the way they define being a man and to explore their pain and trauma. And the results also were very interesting. They saw sustained change over the years. For instance, the violence at home has stopped in 30 out of the 40 families since 2013. And women in 10 families with relapses of the husbands did not experience physical or sexual violence anymore. And this methodology has been adapted for use to other traumatized populations with promising results. It was used with adolescents captured by Boko Haram in Cameroon, and has been applied to in school-based programs for Syrian adolescents in refugee settlements in Lebanon. Next slide, please. Moving on to the Asia-Pacific region, this project in schools of PNG was evaluated and redesigned by Equal Playing in partnership with the Royal Melbourne Institute of Technology. And this intervention of 8 weeks for adolescents focuses on healthy relationships, respectful behaviors, and gender equity. And also very positive outcomes. The schools became more open to facilitating school action group clubs because they saw positive changes in the way the students engage with one another. Next slide, please. Last but not least, this project in Mexico City, Latin America, also focused on adolescents in schools and had very positive results. The study results reinforce the importance of schools as a spaces for violence prevention work and have implications for educational policies on sex education. The study has had far-reaching impact in the region, as its findings have supported regional initiatives in Peru, Ecuador, Guyana, and Bolivia, aimed at strengthening gender-sensitive training for educators. So this has been a super quick tour of the research projects showcased in the thematic briefs, but it gives you a flavor of the diversity, the relevance, and the impact of the research in the field that has been conducted through the SBRI and World Bank grant-making program. I invite you all to visit our website where you will see all the regional reports I already mentioned to you, the thematic briefs, and also links to more information on the projects. Last slide, please. And I also would like to invite you to listen to the Sexual Violence Research Podcast by the SBRI. We just launched the podcast this week, and the first episode is precisely on the strategy of engaging men and boys. Back to you, Diana.
Thank you so much, Angelica. Please stay for the question and answer session, and I'd like all the panelists to join us again, including Rachel. Let me start with a question for those who are working in the field with men and boys. One question that we got in that I think is very interesting was if you make it explicit to the participants that this work is aimed at ending gender-based violence or intimate partner violence, or are you using other entry points like health and sexual and reproductive rights and health education without making it explicit on what your objective is vis-a-vis violence reduction? Any of the panelists can answer if their interventions were shared the objectives, or go ahead, Rachel. Yeah.
Well, thanks. I would say that you obviously don't want to have people not aware that that's one of the things that you're going to be addressing and talking about, because otherwise it really defeats the object. And I think that if you don't feel that you're able to recruit people into to engage them in a program or activities or whatever it is, where you can be explicit about that, then I think you need to do some other preparatory work within the community or the group you're working with before you come in with the program. But having said that, we normally frame it as strengthening relationships, simply because if you want to get people involved in something, you want to frame it as something that they already sort of value and they feel that they want. And in fact, one thing that's been found in South Africa, where Stepping Stones has been combined with Creating Futures, which is a livelihood strengthening intervention, is that the offer of something that can result in stronger livelihoods and therefore more income is absolutely crucial for bringing men to the table to talk about gender. Because, I mean, not only have you got the resistance from men to come and do that, and so, which makes it quite difficult to just recruit them on that basis, but you've got the fact that men have this overwhelming imperative and preoccupation in their lives to actually earn money, particularly when they come from particularly low income segments of the population. And so it's entirely realistic that you need to combine something that will enable men to think they get something out of it around poverty alleviation, as well as addressing and thinking and reflecting on gender issues.
Great. Does anyone else want to come in? Because we have a lot of questions. Mash, you want to add something?
Yes, I would like to say that the intervention that we implemented, we tried to make it comprehensive, sexual and reproductive health issues, and also legal and rights of the two spouses, because we are thinking that the newly wed couple needs to hear those issues, because in a conservative society, we do not talk about sexual and reproductive health issues before marriage. We don't talk about that violence sometimes might be the reasons of no comprehensive or no understanding the others, the needs of the others. So we tried in our intervention to be more comprehensive with the help and support of the health and the clinic, local communities and the clinics and centers. So we think that to be more comprehensive with your topics, religious issues, legal issues, sexual and reproductive health, you might be able to understand what is the most influence subject topic on the violence against women, in particular with the newly coupled.
Great, thanks.
Can I just?
Oh, Godfrey, of course.
Yeah. Okay. So our program addresses 4 major risk factors that are common in the literature that predict the likelihood of GBV and poor parenting. So our program addresses both outcomes for men, for children, and for women. One of them is differential gender socialization. So that's one of the things that we make very clear, that this program would like to engage with you to think about how you raise up male and female children and how relationships are within the family. And also spousal relationships, just like Rachel. So we also say the program seeks to improve spousal relationships. And of course, this means that issues around violence in IPV are addressed. But a key thing that we emphasize, we don't just want to talk about what we want to change, but we also emphasize what there is for men to gain. And as I said, this is one way to motivate them. So you come from an existing concern. So if we say to the men, if you participate in this, you don't lose, but you actually gain. And so we engage fathers to think about what they gain if they are better fathers or if they are better spouses. Of course, it's not so easy initially, it is challenging. But I would also like to say that everything really depends on the qualities of the facilitator and how to what extent the facilitator is themselves transformed in terms of these very behaviors. Thank you.
Okay, thanks, Godfrey. We have another interesting question on how do we use men and boys programs to best target IPV and violence against children simultaneously. Laura, who submits this question, says that the intersection outcomes are often achieved accidentally. How do we best achieve this consciously when designing men and boys programs? Basil, any?
Sure. Thanks, Diana, and thanks, Lauren. I think the Bande Bereho intervention is a really good example of the achievement of both in a deliberate fashion. So it was it is an adapted version of Program P, which Promundo and partners developed, and we've also implemented adaptations of Program P in South Africa. And I think the hence I'm quite familiar with it, but the explicit goal is to improve relationships between parents across genders, but also facilitate a non-violent caregiving of children. And I think that was really one of the striking things about Banda Bereho, is that it achieved both the improvements in the relationship between the parents, but also in terms of reducing risk of violence towards children, which is really exciting. And I think that's it's a really, really important thread for us to follow in terms of the work that we're doing on seeing how we can learn more about doing that kind of preventative work that affects both spaces at the same time.
Let me get in another question, and I think this one, Rachel, is for you, from Clara, and she would want to hear what you think about what is an ideal and thoughtful gender transformative program design include to position women in the work, engaging men and boys from the beginning. What does that look like? What should you do?
Well, there are different ways of doing it, but at the heart of the intervention, gender transformative program has got to involve some work with men and women in workshops, basically. There's got to be some element. It can look different. I mean, the first Stepping Stones intervention that I evaluated was a 50-hour intervention. And in contrast, the couples part of the Transforming Masculinities intervention that was implemented in DRC was 6 sessions, and I think they were only about an hour and a half. So I think it was very, very much shorter. So it does depend a little bit on what's being covered. But at the end of the day, we almost always, even if you're working with couples, you work with the actual work will at least sort of half, if not a bit more than half, is done in single sex groups, because there are big conversations that men and boys need to have with each other, and women and girls need to have with each other, much as it's important to have groups or opportunities where you bring them together. And that facilitates communication across genders, and that is an incredibly important part of the intervention, and enabling and allowing people to practice communication and assertive communication with gender in couples is incredibly important, because it's something that so often hasn't been done. It's so often one of the huge gaps that needs to be filled in terms of empowerment and building relationship skills. So I would say that that's at the heart, and whether what it's embedded in is an intervention like Stepping Stones Creating Futures, where the other bit of it is livelihood strengthening, or just Stepping Stones on its own, which we implemented in schools where there wasn't another piece of the programming, or whether it's in a Transforming Masculinities setting. And in that intervention, there was 2.5 years, I think, of social norms change intervention going on in the community, with a lot of work with faith leaders to try and bring them to the party, and to bring more gender equitable messages into analysis of scriptures and work around that. These are different approaches that may be applicable in one community or one population versus another. But the core of it is that there needs to be some form of manualized program in workshops.
So much, Rachel. Maybe one more question before I pass it over to Liz. Maj, this question is for you. How does supporting better outcomes for, or working with male health workers support better outcomes for women survivors? Mm-hmm. I would think most, the person who asked this, Stephen, thinks that most women want to talk to women about their.
I'm typing the answer. Yes, our program focused on prevention intervention. It's an intervention. It's prevention, the first step. So we prepare the couples for their new lives. The health providers for us also like ambassadors to raise awareness among the new couples. So there are no women survivors in this project and this study. It's just prevention. This first. Second, I'm thinking that we have to highlight that working with men, meaningful participation again with men is a key and a good approach to understand their yani we are not facing in particular in MENA region with men. The problem is not the men, it's the culture that make the men to be like this situation with mentality of accepting violence. So working with men and particular teachers, male health providers and male social providers, male religious, that their thoughts are open and think that gender equality is an important, this might be an important approach with working on gender equality and gender norms.
Thanks so much. Thanks for clarifying. That's really important for us to understand. Liz, over to you. I just want to say thank you to all those who submitted questions. I'm so sorry we couldn't squeeze this all in. We might have a follow-up session. We're taking note of all these questions. There's a lot. We can have another whole seminar just answering these questions. But thank you all for participating. Liz, over to you.
Oh, I have just loved this webinar. So many questions, so much interaction, and so many great resources and ideas and thoughts shared. So thank you. And I just want to make some final words of thanks before we say farewell to you all. First, deep gratitude and thanks to our wonderful speakers and panelists. You can tell by how many people have been commenting about how people have really enjoyed this event. Rachel, thank you for showing how impactful working with men and boys can be when done well, when we central the position of women in the work with men, and we integrate survivor support. I was in a meeting the other day where a group of ministers were calling for a meeting for male leaders to talk about how to engage men in violence against women work without centralizing the voices of women at all. And so I think I might have to just tell them what the current evidence is saying. So thank you, Rachel, for that reminder. I also want to really thank our incredible panelists, Godfrey, Mudge, and Vessel. In a similar vein, thank you all for illuminating how to engage men and boys in practice, the importance of addressing risk factors in communities in which we are working. Context really matters, and how sharing some strategies to address some of the challenges of engaging men and boys in this work, and that we can do it, and it's really important to do so. And then how we should be thinking around more structural change, and of course, from our perspective, how important research has been in everything that you've all been doing. So for that, it's just a great messages that you've been sharing. Diana, thank you. Thank you to the World Bank Group for your partnership and commitment to advancing this research and ensuring that the research is being done and led by low and middle income country-based consortiums and partners. And thank you for commitment to disrupting the way in which research is funded and undertaken. Of course, thank you to you personally for your brilliant moderation skills and always for your insightful ideas and thoughts in the work that we do. And Angelica, thank you for all the hard work, because this really has been an incredible webinar series, and these are great resources that are being shared. And thank you for bringing together this incredible panel and to help us share the research and the ideas in such helpful and meaningful ways. And finally, thank you, Liesl, for producing for us. You've really produced an incredible webinar, and lots of background work has been underway to do so. And finally, thank you to you, the participants, for spending your time with us today. Your engagement, your ideas, your fantastic questions. Given all the questions and this really rich interaction, clearly there's a need for continued unpacking of this work in this area. And so a call to action to all of you, whether you are a researcher, a policymaker, a practitioner, a funder, or an activist, we invite you to join our community. Join the community of global diverse voices committing to address violence against women and violence against children. Collaborations, partnerships are essential, and without them, we cannot build meaningful evidence and programs to end violence against women. So join us. You can learn more, get in touch, and apply for a grant through our website. Again, on a final word of thanks, thank you, everybody, and have a wonderful rest of your day, evening, and farewell. And we look forward to you joining another one in the future. Thank you.